Hey everyone, welcome to week 5. This is the second of 2 weeks that we'll be talking about study design. This week we'll talk about experimental study designs and cohort study designs, and we'll also cover ecological level studies. All experimental studies have a common characteristic that sets them apart from other studies, and this is that the investigator assigns the exposure and then can manipulate it. The type of participants needed for an experimental study are those who are at risk of the outcome. So they don't have the outcome now, but they could possibly get it in the future. After volunteers are recruited, investigators assign them to an exposure group. Typically, these are called the treatment or experimental group and the control group. Participants can be assigned to these groups by a random method or non-random method. When they are randomly assigned, this is called randomization. The next step in the process is for the researchers to administer the treatment. For example, the exposed group gets a medication and the unexposed group gets a placebo. After some amount of time passes, the third step is for the researchers to collect outcome data, see if that new medication worked or not. To do this, they would calculate incidence. Hopefully, incidence in the exposed group would be less than incidence in the unexposed group if investigators are testing a new medication. Finally, investigators would compare these incidences by calculating a risk or rate ratio or a risk or rate difference. There are several different types of experimental studies. The most common is a randomized control trial. This is where participants are randomly assigned or randomized to the comparison groups. Next is a quasi-experimental study, and this is the same as a randomized controlled trial, except instead of participants being randomized to exposure groups, they are just assigned by some non-random method. Another type of experimental study is a single-arm trial where participants are assigned to an exposure, but there is no control group, no comparison group. Another type of experimental study is a crossover design where participants are first assigned to one exposure group, and then after a period of time are assigned to the other exposure group. You saw this flowchart last week, and we got as far as observational versus experimental studies. And again, the question here is, was the exposure assigned? Did the investigator actually give or tell the participants what to be exposed to? If the answer is yes, then the study is experimental. The next distinguishing factor, as we've talked about, is randomization, where participants randomly assign to exposure groups. If the answer is yes, the design is a randomized control trial. If no, the design is a quasi-experimental or another subtype of experimental study. These are the most common, RCT and quasi. Some terminology specific to experimental studies that you should know are randomization, control group, blinding, and placebo. Next, let's talk about cohort studies. Cohort studies are observational. They are, in fact, the observational equivalent of experimental studies. When we look at how cohort studies are conducted, they are conducted almost exactly like experimental studies. Eligible participants are those who don't have the outcome, who are at risk. But now, instead of assigning participants to exposure groups, investigators assess what exposures are happening in the real world and measure those, and use those to categorize participants into an exposed and unexposed group. Next, a cohort study will collect exposure and outcome data repeatedly during a follow-up period. The investigators will then calculate the incidence of the outcome for the exposed and unexposed groups and compare the incidences by calculating a risk or rate ratio or a risk or rate difference. Unlike experimental studies, which are always prospective, cohort studies can be prospective, meaning looking forward, or retrospective, meaning looking backwards. Here's a simplified flowchart of a cohort study, starting with outcome-free participants, classifying them by their exposure status, which is happening in the real world, and then categorizing them according to who in each exposure group has the outcome or not. Prospective studies start by assembling a cohort and then collecting data on that cohort for some follow-up period. Retrospective cohort studies find some existing group of people as their cohort and collect data about those people during a follow-up period in the past. Now we can fill in the last observational study in our flowchart. Among the observational studies, the defining feature of a cohort study is that the exposure is assessed first and exposure groups are compared. Now let's talk about ecological level studies. Ecological level studies are defined by who is in their comparison groups. So far, all the studies we've discussed are individual level, and individual level studies compare groups of individuals. Ecological level studies are different in that they do not compare groups of individuals, they compare groups of places. For example, comparing dietary factors and cancer incidence in Western countries versus Asian countries. A study level is different than a study design. Different study designs can be conducted at different levels. For example, an experimental study aimed at healthy eating in elementary schools. If the study were individual level, it might give the intervention to some students and not to others, and then compare these groups of kids to see if those in the intervention group ended up eating healthier than those in the control group. If the intervention were conducted at the ecological level, the investigators might give the intervention to some whole schools and not to others, and then compare those schools to see if the average level of healthy eating at intervention schools became better than that at control schools. And now this is an example of a retrospective cohort study conducted at the ecological level. The research question is, are public smoking bans associated with a reduction in lung cancer incidence? This study could be conducted on a group of cities where some of them enacted public smoking bans and some of them didn't. In the years after enacting the bans, the study would compare average lung cancer incidence rates in exposed versus unexposed cities. To summarize this week's content, experimental studies are defined as those in which the investigator assigns the exposure. Temporality in experimental studies is clear. We know that the exposure came before the outcome because the investigators administered it. Cohort studies are conducted just like experimental studies, except the exposure is observed and not assigned. But again, temporality is clear since nobody has the outcome at the beginning of the study, and the exposure is measured first. Incidence measures of frequency and association are the appropriate ones to calculate for experimental and cohort studies, but you could also calculate odds. Finally, ecological studies are not a study design, but a level, and they compare groups of places, not groups of individuals. Good luck with the module, and just let me know if you have any questions. Bye, everyone!